The US and Israel are on collision course over the Gaza war. Differences have emerged as Israel has surrounded the crowded Khan Younis city in southern Gaza. Civilian casualties, divergent war aims have divided the traditional allies. How to tackle Iran-backed Houthis is also turning into a sticking point. Here are the four main issues on which the US and Israel seem to be taking different paths. The first point of difference, of course, between both the allies is on when the war should end. Israel's fight to capture Khan Younis is putting Tel Aviv on collision course with Team Biden. Remember, the crowded Khan Younis is a Hamas stronghold, believed to be the suspected hiding place of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Israel's military operation in Khan Younis has just begun and is expected to last at least 3 to 4 weeks. Also remember, Khan Younis' population is 400,000 in normal times, but the numbers have now doubled, mostly because thousands more have taken refuge here from Gaza city. Israel is presently fighting militants in Khan Younis in the midst of very crowded neighborhoods. And Team Biden wants the war to end in weeks and not months, given the growing global pressure over rising civilian casualties. A Politico report last week, citing anonymous Israeli officers, claimed that Team Biden has told Israel that it has until December end to wrap up the war. The deadline was underlined by the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on a visit to Israel recently. Israel is reportedly more committed to a January end date, after hoping to flush out the entire Hamas leadership from southern Gaza.
On this last trip, as Israel has moved the campaign against Hamas to the south, we have focused in, as you've said, on the imperative of maximizing efforts to protect civilians and get not only assistance in, but to sustain the higher level of assistance that was reached during the humanitarian pause and actually build on it. Having said that, as we stand here almost a week into this campaign in the south after the end of the humanitarian pause, it is imperative, it remains imperative that Israel put a premium on civilian protection. And there does remain a gap between exactly what I said when I was there, the intent to protect civilians, and the actual results that we're seeing on the ground.
Which brings me to the point number 2, civilian casualties. Since the start of Israel's military action against Hamas, the Biden administration has been behind them lock, stock, and barrel. But as civilian deaths mount and pictures and videos from Gaza make global headlines, the chinks in the armor are beginning to show. There is growing impatience with Israel's current approach. The divergence also extends to how much aid to allow into Gaza and how often. Speaking at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California last week, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and I quote, "I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative. And so I have personally pushed Israeli leaders to avoid civilian casualties and to shun irresponsible rhetoric, and to prevent violence by settlers in the West Bank, and to dramatically expand access to humanitarian aid." Unquote. US and Israel are also using different rhetorics about the eventual aim of the war in Gaza. Israel's stated aim is to eliminate Hamas, and they are sticking to their guns on that. The US, meanwhile, is focusing on ending Hamas's reign and power. Washington believes that, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, eradicating Hamas is impossible, but the threat from the group can be dramatically reduced.
What we have, I think, demonstrated to a fairly well is that you can decapitate a terrorist organization, you can decimate their capabilities, you can render them a lot less effective. You're probably never going to get rid of the ideology that backs them up and allows them to recruit into resource. But look at ISIS right now. It's a shadow of itself. Remember, they were storming across Iraq and Syria with this big caliphate that they wanted to govern. It's a shadow of its former self. Still a viable threat, which is why we have some troops on the ground, but it's nowhere near the threat that it once was. And Al-Qaeda, the same thing.
How to tackle the Houthis? The US and Israel are divided on this very important point. Iran-backed Houthis control North Yemen and have been firing drones and missiles at Israel for weeks. Reports say that the US wants American military only to respond to Houthis rather than Israel. This is to avoid a larger flare-up in the entire Middle East. But the Houthis have now vowed to target all Israel-bound ships in Red Sea. Israel is unlikely to sit quietly on this threat. Underlining all of this is the domestic political pressure on Joe Biden, who is heading into an election year. As images of children and women from Gaza flood social media, Biden's unwavering support for Israel is hurting his support from left-leaning Democrats. US media reports talk about the growing discontent, tense meetings, and dissent cables even within the Biden administration against Gaza's siege. Hamas says that the death toll in the enclave has risen past 16,000 in the war. Notably, these statistics do not distinguish between militants and civilians. And while Israel is leading its own military campaign in Gaza, Netanyahu's breathing room for the war does depend on Washington to a great extent.